Silicon Valley to BPL Mobile to the upper house of Parliament, Rajeev Chandrasekhar has always followed his heart. An advocate of reforms, this entrepreneur parliamentarian always tells it like it is. It's time for Chandrasekhar's report card.
Well, joining us now from Bangalore is Rajeev Chandrasekhar. Rajeev, many thanks for joining us. Let me start by asking you, and this is a funny story. I was reading a blog of yours that you wrote before the budget in July, and you said, personally, I've long since learned to ignore pre-budget hype and read and watch the expectation drama only if I have very little else to do or I'm struggling for a cure of temporary sleep deprivation. What's keeping you up these days?
No, it's not the budget for sure. What's keeping me up is essentially concern about the second generation reforms and not really linked to the budget, but a number of things that I believe that the government ought to be doing that we clearly are not doing enough of.
Okay, Rajeev, you also spoke then about the fact that India at this point needs a tax, borrow and investment economic architecture as opposed to a tax, borrow and spend fiscal strategy. That's what we've had in the past, but you want a tax, invest economic architecture. Do you think in the last year, since the last budget, the government has done enough to get this economic architecture in place?
No, no, not at all, Shirin. I genuinely believe that the last 1 year we have spent essentially waiting for the global economy to recover. I don't think we've done very much internally to set ourselves up for the time when we de-link from the stimulus and have to grow the economy on the other sound principles of investment and the basic principles of growth, which is invest and grow. I think a lot of the time that's been spent the last 1 year has been spent on, are we recovering, are we getting out of the economic crisis, should the stimulus continue. It has been a stimulus-led growth. It hasn't been what I believe is a sustainable model for growth.
But to be fair, Rajeev, given the extraordinary situation that the world was facing, and not just India, in terms of the stimulus measures, do you think that at least what the government has done to sort of recover from the economic shock, at least there you would give the government's high point? No,
look, the point I was making is not that the stimulus was wrong. I think the stimulus was right. It was appropriate, it was necessary, and doing nothing at that point would have led us to a pretty bad situation. What I was hoping that we would have done in the last 12 months is set the basis for reforms. We have not done very much by way of architecting, if you want to call it that, the second generation of reforms in the last 12 months, which we could have done in anticipation of the global economy getting ready to look outward and invest more aggressively.
Okay, if I were to be specific, Rajeev, and ask you to list out the big failures or the big misses, because, if I were to list out what the last budget had actually talked about, the direct tax code, they were hoping to introduce the bill in the winter session of Parliament. That didn't happen. The goods and services tax, the finance minister had said that there was consensus as far as the GST was concerned. That has now been delayed beyond the April 1 deadline, perhaps now going to be implemented only next year. If you were to list out the misses or the failures, what would those be specifically?
Our history has taught us that it's not about failures as much as missed opportunities. And we seem to be looking at every year as a year that we don't care if we lose because there is another year in the future. I would have expected the last 1 year, and I said this in my budget speech during the last budget, that the last 1 year was really a wait and watch year, a year for us to consolidate and prepare for a time when the world wakes up from the crisis and the world gets ready to start aggressively investing in emerging markets like India and China. And for that, we should have done a large number of things architecturally from a point of view of, you mentioned a few of them. You mentioned the GST, you mentioned the direct tax code, you mentioned, I could mention, for example, governance reforms. We still are struggling with a very basic element of how to auction telecom licenses. There are a number of things we could have done from a point of view of governance reforms that would have prepared India Inc. and India to absorb large amounts of FDI and investments that are fundamental to our growth story going forward.
So given what we are seeing on these fronts, Rajeev, how hopeful are you that Budget 2010 will indeed present some sort of bold reforms, will take the second generation reforms forward? The finance minister has a challenge on the fiscal side. He has fiscal constraints to deal with. So how hopeful are you that we are going to see some of those bold reforms make their presence felt this time around in this budget?
Shirin, I said this in July 2009 and I say it again. I think what we should hope for from the budget is a directional signal. In the last budget, the finance minister talked about continuous reforms. He talked, and that really was exactly what we wanted to hear. We wanted to hear that, notwithstanding what the budget said or did not say, that the government was committed to, in the next 4 or 5 years, a series of continuous reforms and not stop and go reforms. Unfortunately, in my humble opinion, the last 1 year has not necessarily translated into action around those claims. I would hope that this budget, more than the numbers and the excise duties, would indicate a stronger sense of the direction of reforms, both governance, both economic and governance, in the next 3-4 years.
Okay, speaking of missed opportunities, Rajeev, and I know you've spoken about this in the past, you know, here was a government that actually has the political mandate, it has the political numbers, and hence it should have been able to push through some of those difficult reforms. It's only perhaps gone ahead as far as disinvestment was concerned, because that was, you know, stuck on account of the left, but pension, you know, insurance, retail, none of those other big ticket reforms that were expected to take place have actually taken place. Are you hopeful that perhaps those will get moving this time around?
No, I mean, I was hopeful in July 2009. So, I mean, you know, as far as hope goes, I'm an eternal optimist and I continue to hope. But more specifically, to answer your question, I hope the budget and events around the budget signal that we are actually going to do it. I mean, there is hoping and then there is reality. I mean, I think the need for us is to see real initiatives from the government that put together signal a direction and an architecture that will be, in a sense, the catalyst for growth for the next 3 to 4 years.
Okay, so the bottom line, if I were to ask you, Rajeev Chandrasekhar, you think that the government has fallen short of your expectations on the economic front in the past year?
Yes, I believe that we could have done a lot more, and I think last year would go down as maybe somewhat of a missed opportunity.
All right, somewhat of a missed opportunity. Let's hope that Budget 2010 will indeed put in place that economic architecture that you are talking about. Rajeev Chandrasekhar, many thanks for taking the time out and speaking to us here on CNBC TV 18 today.
Thank you.